Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you with us today. I'm David Powell, and I'm the SVP of Sales at Perch. And I've come from the managed services space. I've spent 20 plus years in the managed services space, worked for some of the top MSPs out there. I've also been over on the vendor side. I'm back on the vendor side now at Perch Security, and happy to be with you all today. And we have Wes Spencer, Chief Information Security Officer, with us. Wes, go and introduce yourself a little bit.
Hey, yeah. So, David, you're the guy that needs no introductions. I think everybody knows you in the industry. So we're happy to have you at Perch. Truly privileged. Hey, I'm Wes Spencer. I'm the CISO, as David said. My job is just to help MSPs, just like you guys, think through cybersecurity. How do we build, run, manage, maintain a really good cybersecurity offering? And of course, I take care of Perch's own internal security as well. It is awesome to be with you guys.
Yes. So Wes has 4 kids. I've got 1 son and a daughter. And, you reach that point, probably, middle schoolish, whatever, where it's, time to have the talk, right? So you go do something with them. Hilariously, one of my friends, he had to talk with his son. They were like hiking and he explains it all. And his son was like, "Dad, am I going to have to do that?" He goes, "Son, you're going to want to, trust me." So, everyone has that like awkward conversation. And, at some point you've got to have that talk around security with your clients. And like it says in the abstract for this, the talk with your clients doesn't come with the awkward mental pictures that the talk with your kids, has, but it's important that we do go have that talk. And look, we get it. Just like the talk with your kids, that's a talk no one really kind of wants to have, right? And going out and talking to your clients and talking to them about security and telling them they're at risk and telling them all the challenges, that's a talk not many people want to have. So today we're going to go and try to demystify that for you and help you understand how to have the talk with your kids. I mean, Wes, are yours old enough for you to have had the talk yet?
Yeah, so I've got one that is, and we splice it in as much as we can. But I've had to have one where we have had the more dedicated talk. And yeah, look, it's awkward, and it's awkward for you the first few times you have the cybersecurity talk with your client. We know the fears, right? We're going to talk about those fears. We're going to talk about how you get through them. And I promise you, I have had to do the same talks with my board at my bank. And David has done this innumerable times with his clients. So let us hold your hand and walk you through this, David.
Yeah, it'll be interesting by the time you get to your 4th kid, Wes. It'll be so easy by that time for you to have the talk.
Yeah, she'll be like, "Oh, I've already heard it from my siblings."
That's right. So, Wes, we can both talk about these things, but I think the first thing you have to talk about when you go have the talk is what are the objections you're going to get, right? It's like, "Hey, Wes, I need to talk about security," and immediately in your head, you see dollar signs, right? And so you're gonna be like, "Oh, well, David, I'm too small. No one wants my data." But Wes, we have really good data around how the SMB market is really targeted here. Like, what are we seeing out here with the SMB space?
Yeah, I mean, look, everybody's a target now, right? I just got off a webinar that I did earlier this morning. It was talking actually just to all SMBs on behalf of a partner. And one of the things I told him, I said, "You are a target. And let me illustrate and show this to you." And we talked about how the new ransomware of today is now driven by ransomware operators who then send that out to affiliates. It's what Perch calls ransomware as a service. And what that means is these affiliates are going after everybody. It's indiscriminate. And so if I'm talking to a client, they say, "Look, I'm too small." The answer back is, that used to be true 5 years ago. Today, it's not. I can't tell you how many organizations we see, large and small, that are all getting hit, from local libraries to small law enforcement to lawyers' offices and small chiropractor clinics. They don't care. They're going after everybody. In some ways, it's wide sweeps and they're zoning in from there. But in other ways, they are targeting specific industries. And so, unfortunately, Mr. Client, it is true in the old day that you were too small, but no longer is that. And by the way, if you're listening and you want to actualize that, one thing that helps is, how about a number? So roughly around $114,000 is the average small business ransomware financial transaction on average. How about that, David? I mean, that's an easy way to put it into numbers, and that's not counting reputational damage, outages, cost of recovery. And as we talked on the cyber call a few weeks ago, look, cyber insurance is not just the magic bullet that solves all of that. There are still things that happen inside of all of the insurance payments. And so I just say, you can't use the "I'm too small." You can't afford to let your clients use that excuse either. So just talk with them confidently and say, "Yeah, it used to be true, but here's why it's not anymore." Yeah. And then you also run into that other objection of like, "Look, I'm too small. I mean, I'm sorry, nobody wants my data." Again, used to be true. You know who your data is valuable to? you and to your clients. So I don't care if you make soccer balls and you think there's no IP behind a soccer ball. Let me tell you, there is. The process you have on your machines that actually make your soccer balls and blow them up with air and whatever it is that they do, that data is valuable, because if you have no data and you have no AP and your machines can't run and do what they're doing, then guess what happens? A complete loss of product operation, which means a loss in revenue. So yes, your data is valuable. There's no other way around it. It is absolutely valuable. And then that last one, I can't afford to be secure. Again, yesterday I was on a call and I had a client tell me this. He said, my clients can't afford super awesome cybersecurity. I'm like, how about the cost of a cell phone bill? I'm like, well, wait, what are you talking about? I'm like, look, let's look through purchase pricing and some of the other things that you have built into this. You've got to get an understanding that a good MSP-focused cybersecurity vendor who understands the channel, understands scalability in that price model, which then means that it's something that's affordable and scalable for everybody. So, I mean, the great thing about Perch, David, is just a simple example. It might cost 6 or 7 figures for a super large organization to use Perch. A small little organization with 50 employees, again, the cost of a cell phone bill. So we've got to get through that as well. They can afford to be secure, and you've got to not be afraid of that price tag.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting was you talked about that $100,000 number. I mean, most small businesses, if you just went and sucked $100,000 out of their checking account, they're not making payroll. They're in a heap of hurting. I mean, most of them don't just have an extra $100,000, laying around. And I think what's funny is this, I have cyber insurance almost becomes this get out of jail free card. But what's really interesting around that, and as we're beginning to see, is that, if I have State Farm auto insurance, but State Farm doesn't cover me drunk driving, right? Because they would view that as negligent. And so they were like, we don't cover negligence, right? We cover normal operation. And the cyber insurance, if you read all the little fine print, which most people don't, basically says that you're doing the normal, generally accepted best practices in your cybersecurity, and then they cover stuff beyond that. It's not a get out of jail free card where you can basically go be a drunk driver and car insurance still covers you. I mean, we see in cyber insurance is not the panacea to these problems, right?
That's right. Yep, that's right. And then, I think that last one I did want to cover as well quickly. This whole, I thought you were already doing this for me.
Oh, yeah.
David, that is the number one fear. And I want you to elaborate on this too, but that is the number one fear that MSPs have is, you mean I got to go back to the drawing board and tell my client? He's going to yell at me and he's going to say, well, I thought you were already doing all this for me. Now you just want more money. I can't go and ask him that.
Yeah.
Let's pause that for a minute and say, whoa. That fear is, it's all in how you phrase the lead up through the talk, right? If I just walk in guns blazing and say, you got to pay more, of course they're going to say that. But if you walk through how, what we've been talking about, David, threats are changing. The landscape of threats are changing. You're now a target where you weren't used to be. The cost of the ransomware is just skyrocketed from 10,000 to 6 figures. When you start talking in language like the threats have changed, what does that, ergo, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Our response needs to change. We need to do something new about it. No client is going to be shocked at that. They're going to understand, okay, if I believe you that threats are changing, then I believe you that we've got to do something new and we've got to do more. So we got to not be afraid of that. And the way we can distill some of that fear is just by making sure we do a really good job adequately discussing the threat landscape, risk profiling, how all of these things have really changed for our clients.
Well, and I think the reason they think that is this real common misperception, and this is something that you talk about all the time, right? This is a risk conversation, not a technology conversation. And the reasons the small business owners think the MSP is doing this for them is because they think cybersecurity is technology, and I'm paying this MSP to do my technology. End of story. When it's not that, right? It's like, hey, we're doing the core pieces, but then there's all this other stuff that is additional risk that you want to mitigate. And I can talk to you around, how to do that. But, when you really kind of think through this, it's that, idea of is this going to cost me more? And you touched on it a little bit, but that idea of the cost of inaction has really, really, really changed, right? Is that, you can't afford to run your business without liability insurance. You can't afford to, have a family of 6 without health insurance, right? The cost of inaction is just too high. You have another kid and, you go bankrupt because you can't afford those hospital bills, right? So the cost of inaction has gone really up. How would you kind of help think through that with a client that, looks at this cost and they're like, well, doing nothing is cheaper, when demonstrating to them that actually doing nothing is way more expensive?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of analogies, David, we could use here. One that comes to my mind, like my mind is just spinning on these things. I'll tell you one that makes a lot of sense to me is like termite inspections and like all the pest control stuff, right? The inaction, yeah, can I save 50, 60 bucks a month by not having all that in place? Of course. But what happens when the termites get, I live in Florida, right? It's like termite central. What happens when they get into the building? What happens when they get into my home? It is extremely more expensive than that, right? It's what we're talking about is being proactive. Use a dental analogy. How about this one, right? What's the cost of inaction of never going to the dentist? Root canals, losing your teeth, fake teeth, the whole old people,
Pain.
the dentures and all that stuff. Pain, right? It's the same thing in the world of cyber. Again, share, like if I'm sharing in front of a client and I use humor like that along with the analogy, they're going to understand that. They're like, okay, I follow you. You're right. The cost of inaction makes sense to me. Again, we're not asking to go spend, tens of thousands of dollars more. We're asking little bits more that eliminate the cost of what that inaction would be. And again, if we need to go back and talk about the result of it, $114,000, like we mentioned earlier, that's the cost of ransomware today for a small business. So there's your answers.
Yeah. And one thing I think that we always want to talk to our clients about is this idea of like convenient or secure, right? And so I was looking to buy a car several years ago, and this friend of mine has this other friend, Joe, and Joe's a lawyer, and he's kind of one of those billboard lawyers, if you've been affected by mesothelioma kind of guys, right? And so as you would expect, a guy like that has a 6-car garage, right? And has a gorgeous assortment of lots of different stuff. And in the far right garage is this Ferrari. And my buddy Derek knows Joe pretty well. And so I was looking at the car I was interested in buying, which was not a Ferrari for the record. And Derek's like, hey, Joe, can we take the Ferrari out? Can David and I go drive it? And Joe's like, sure, the keys are on the dash. And I'm like, the keys are on the dash. The most expensive asset he has, the keys are on the dash. And I'm like, Joe, that's not a good idea. He goes, well, if the garage door is down, it's secure. And man, that event has stuck with me so much, is that's how so many people view security in their workplace, right? Is that the perimeter is secure, we got a firewall, we got all that kind of stuff. Well, then everything inside, can be convenient, right? Because the keys are right there. When really, as we all know, like layered security is what you want to see. And so kind of using an analogy with Joe is that he should have had the garage door down, the Ferrari should have been locked, then the door to his mudroom from his garage should have been locked, and then the keys to the Ferrari should have been in a locked combination box, inside the mudroom. And that's the layered security to protect your assets. Wes, in March, companies all around the country, between like March 19th and March 26th, took all their employees and sent them home, right? And they did it to be convenient, but did they do it to be secure? What are we seeing happen as a result of this huge work from home push?
Well, before I answer that, be right back. I need to go put my Ferrari keys somewhere more safe.
That's right. Go secure your Ferrari.
Unfortunately, I don't have the Ferrari problem of your friend.
Yeah.
Yes. No, you're right. So one of the things I did, I made a blog. I was very curious during that time in March of what will this pandemic do to us and what are we seeing in the threat landscape around us? And I wrote a blog post on this. And if anyone's interested in that, just hit me up, right? Just reach out to me. Be happy to share that blog post. It's on Perch's website. And I looked at remote desktop protocol traffic inside Perch and outside the rest of the world and compared that pre-pandemic and in the middle, and then also like a few months after. And what we saw, David, a huge ramp up of new RDP inbound traffic. And why was that? Because notably, all of these MSPs are like, how are we going to accommodate? We're not prepared for this. No one was prepared for it. Flip on RDP, let people remote in. We'll solve that problem later. It's the age-old problem, David, of security versus usability, right? We can have something so secure it's not usable. We can have something so usable it's not secure. And we naturally pivoted towards that. If you're one of those MSPs that pivoted towards a lot more openness in your connections and access for your clients, and you've not gone back and visit that, I implore you to do so. I can't tell you how many MSPs I am aware of and their clients that were breached because of those decisions that were made during that time. Now, I understand sometimes you do have to make those decisions for a short time, but you've got to understand the risk. Just like the Ferrari in the garage, I don't think he really understood the risk of a Ferrari with keys on the dash and a weak, easy to get into garage. Had he understood that threat a little bit better, he probably would have protected those keys. And it's the same way in security. It is our job, David, to advise and be the trusted CIO for our clients in letting them know where the risks are and how we mitigate those things, because they don't know the answers to this. They just know they need to work. So it's our job to consider these things and really understand it when we're building our security programs, David.
Yeah, and the risk of the keys on the dash were nothing compared to him giving me and Derek the keys to take that car out. But
night on the town.
What we used to talk to our clients about when I was in the MSP space was this idea of like, are you getting your users to be committed, or are you getting them to be compliant, right? And so the story I would use to illustrate that is recycling day here where I live is on Tuesdays, right? And my kids, I want them to take the recycling down. Well, I can tell them, hey, take the recycling down, and they'll go do it. Well, now they're compliant, versus what I really want is for them to remember the recycling day is Tuesday and roll that recycling down on their own. And so that's that kind of structure that we want to get to, is that you don't want your employees, just like, okay, I'll do this thing. You want them to understand why that's important. So when they get that password reset message, every month or so, that they're not like, oh, this sucks, that they're like, oh, this makes sense. This is to secure the organization. This is what we need to be doing. And so how do you get them to be bought into that instead of just getting their compliance and, thinking about security? And that's a whole cultural thing. Like, Wes, one of the things we see now going on all the time is this, like, if you were the CEO and I was the accounts payable guy, and I come to you and I'm like, hey, Wes, do you really want me to wire you $250,000? If you yell at me, you're not driving that culture of commitment, right? If you're like, yes, David, I really want to, then I'm like, okay, and I go and do it. Then the one time that's fraudulent, we'll have that conversation and won't do it. So that's that whole cultural kind of commitment thing instead of just getting compliance from people. And I think you coming from banking was very much like that, where everyone understood the security risk and was kind of bought in as opposed to just checking the boxes.
Yeah, there's so much to say about that. But let me say it this way. The best way I know to sum it up, like, Princess Bride, where the man, it's too much. Let me sum up.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. Sets the minimum, not the maximum. So when I'm approaching compliance, all compliance can do is say, this is the minimum amount you must do. Used with that the recycling analogy. And so it's good to have compliance. Those that have clients over them, it's good. Use that to your advantage. But compliance will only ever set the minimum. And when I came into the bank, one of the things I wanted to do is set a culture of, hey, security is a business enabler. It's an advantage. It's a competitive advantage for us among our clients. And so really preach that message and champion it. And I was fortunate to buy in of my CEO, who then repeated the same message, repeating. And all of a sudden we kind of saw security transform into this is the minimum. You got to do these things. The whip into, hey, here are advantages of this. And here's how we're using this to distinguish. And here's why it's so important for all of us. And just the mantra, David.
Yep. So the other part is that, everybody loves a good story, usually told around a campfire, right? But your MSP sales team needs to be able to tell a good story, right? So just like when you're telling a ghost story at the campfire, right? The ghost or the monster in the woods, you never get to see them, right? But everybody's kind of scared about it, right? It's this ephemeral thing out there that's like coming to get you, the boogeyman. And I think that with lots of MSPs, and they're talking to their clients, it becomes this like boogeyman thing. There's some bad guy way out there somewhere wanting to come hack your stuff, right? And so it's hard for the client to really see them in a story where security, was breached. So Wes, we unfortunately have lots of these. Like what in your opinion is like a good quick story that an MSP could sell their client and say like, this is what's happening. And then the client can see themselves in it and recognize the importance of it, and then the need to act, as opposed to it being the boogeyman in the woods that you never see.
So, David, I'll tell you a story. Let's create a virtual fire and sit down next to me as I tell you the scary story of Sally Sue and how she wired out a whole lot of money, right? Who wouldn't listen to that story? But I want to share how this happens, right? Let's talk about what's called BEC, business email compromise, how these things happen, and why this is important. So personally at Perch, we're seeing more and more of our MSP partners, their clients are being affected by this, and they're coming back to me and others, you and others at Perch, and say, hey, how do I stop this? How do I message around this? How do I educate around this? And so I want to give you some thoughts on it, right? Just as one example, and this is what paints that story of why it's real. The threat is real. So here's what happened. Unknowingly, Sally Sue clicked on an email that she thought was legitimate, and it took her to a phishing message. It was one of those like, hey, your password's expired in Office 365. And she's like, oh, that happens occasionally. So she goes to this website, doesn't look at the URL at the top. Unfortunately, it's a phishing message. And so she inputs her username, her password, and it asks her for a one-time credential. She enters all of that in, and then she doesn't think anything the wiser, just goes back to normal and doesn't think anything. Well, she just handed the bad guy who is active and watching her credentials, and they now have access into her email. Well, she's not watching. She has no idea this happened. So she just goes on her normal business. What the bad guy does behind the scenes, David, is he creates a number of things. One of the things he does is he creates some email forwarding rules. And so he has all of his emails forwarding from Sally Sue to badguy@russian.ru or wherever it happens to be where the bad guy's watching. And why does he do that? Well, he's doing that because he wants to watch the emails coming back and forth from Sally Sue. He's watching, he's looking for an important email. And one of those important emails is a legitimate email from somebody else that says, hey, Sally Sue, you guys are due for your payment. Here's your invoice. It's $32,000, just, normal wire instructions, whatever it is. And that's when he takes action. He's been waiting for this. He's been sitting there lurking, watching and waiting, and then he takes action and he sends an email back and says, oh, hey, Sally Sue, actually, that's incorrect. It needs to go to this wire instead. Or because he has access to Sally's email, Sally approves it and sends it to her AP, and then he uses Sally's email to create a fraudulent but legitimate email from Sally Sue to whoever's paying the bill and says, oh, no, I made a mistake. Here's an updated Excel spreadsheet. It needs to go here instead. David, what's the ramification of that? It's pretty simple. What happens is it looks legitimate. It feels legitimate because it's coming to and from Sally's email addresses. Before they know it, whoever makes that payment to the bank authorizes a significant amount of money to the wrong place. The only time it gets caught is usually a day after when the balances books are being done, or whoever's waiting for that payment says, I still haven't gotten it. They go back and look and oops, it was sent out to some guy who's a mule account in Montana who then sent it out to Russia, and it will never be seen again. That's a classic example of business email compromise. Usually those funds are never returned. And so what happens in a situation like that is a company is just completely left in the blind thinking, how did this happen to us? Why did we not know? We didn't know because we weren't active. We weren't visible. We weren't looking at the notifications happening. They're showing invalid logins. That were showing new email forwards created, new activity and behavioral out-of-band norms that were occurring that we weren't taking action on. And so that's a pretty scary story, right? I'd be trembling in my boots if I heard that if I'm a business owner. And a very easy story that unfortunately, David, happens almost every single day.
All the time. What's funny about that is people instead of questioning too get so scared. I was talking to a guy that does penetration testing, and I was asking him, like, how do you get past multi-factor authentication? And the example you use, Sally Sue, doesn't want to be in trouble for being compromised. So he has their email credentials. And he said what they would do is they'd call and say, hey, this is David from the IT staff. Wes, you're not in trouble. Okay, no one knows yet, but your email's been compromised. We're going to take it offline, get it fixed. In fact, we're about to reset your credentials. You're going to get a passcode sent, a new number sent to your phone. I need you to read those to me real quick. And then I'll get it reset, and I'll tell you when it's okay to get back in. And he said like 99% of the time, the people read the numbers off their phone because they're so scared about getting into trouble. So, I know if I was a client, I can see myself in all those circumstances, right? Is that no one wants to be in trouble. People don't pay good attention to what they're clicking. They don't have the discipline on that. They're scared to go ask, hey, is this really where this money is supposed to go? And, I think the more that we could tell those stories as an MSP to our client, real stories, then the client can be like, uh-oh, I can see that happening to me. And then it's no longer the boogeyman, in the woods. I think another thing that you see lots of times, and you're very much an expert on this, but, we need to be able to give them actionable steps, is that you can't just go in and tell your client, you need to get better at security, right? I mean, well, what does that mean? Just like, hey, I need you to be more healthy. Well, what does that mean? Do I need to exercise? Do I need to eat better? Like what's my challenge and stuff? And so I think there's this idea of, that it seems obvious maybe what you should do next, instead of saying, here's the actionable steps. We need to do this, 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 and this. And I will say that one of the struggles that a lot of MSPs do is what I call the scare and sell, which they come in, they do an assessment, they drop this 6-inch binder on your table. Here's all the stuff you suck at, Wes, and you're like, well, I don't want to do any of those things. And instead of saying like, hey, here's a standard, here's where you are, and here's 3 things we need you to do today. And then when you finish those 3, we'll look at another 3. So Wes, talk to us about like some easy examples of what people can do to get better, how to think about some of the standards. Even if a standard doesn't apply to you, is that a good thing to look to align to if you're not in a standards-driven industry? How do you kind of conceptualize that stuff?
Yeah. So again, you heard us say from the very beginning, this should be a risk-based approach. This should be a risk-based conversation. And so if you're chasing all of your time and resources on some systemic, unlikely, low damage outcome, you're probably wasting a lot of time. So usually when we approach this from risk, to give you a framework to look through, we should be thinking through the lens of what's the likelihood of this risk and what's the damage. So things that may have low likelihood, high damage, something we should focus on. Something that has low damage but high likelihood, also something we should focus on. And obviously high damage, high likelihood, definitely we should focus on. And so that should be the framework. That's the matrix that we kind of work through our actionable next steps. And so focus on that first. So I give you examples. If you have an organization that is, or you're getting a new one and they're not doing things like patch management, you got to start there first, right? Absolutely. You got to start there first. If you're working with an organization that, has no oversight, for example, things like Perch does, no one's monitoring the networks. That's a huge place to start first, right? If you're working with an organization that does no security awareness training, those are red flags that you've got to address, right? And so these are not just things I'm thinking off the top of my head. These are things when you're working through the critical security controls, you're working through the NIST cybersecurity framework, going back to those frameworks, they will guide you on the important things. They will give you instructions and thoughts on here's what I start with first. And as you build that experience, like we talked about before, you'll be able to understand what those key actionable next steps are, and it will become more natural for you. I promise you. Last thing I might say is there's some good guidelines that are out there. Also check out the Global Cyber Alliance and what they're doing. Very simple cybersecurity checklists that start with the basic things, the basic hygiene, and that is how you start with an approachable, actionable, next step oriented, something that you can accomplish. Because David, you're right. The 6 feet, the big, stacks of paper of endless stuff that makes no sense, you just drop on the desk. That does not work because it makes no sense to them. And they'll be like, I can't do that. I don't know what that is. No point in even trying. It is impossible to accomplish.
Yeah. I always kind of equate it to like if you went to a personal trainer, right? The personal trainer is like, oh man, well, you can only eat 1,000 calories a day and you have to go run 5 miles a day. You're like, well, I can't do any of that stuff. So I'm just going to get some donuts on my way home from this meeting, right? Instead of like, hey, David, can we cut out desserts this week? Maybe just eat dessert on a Saturday. And can we just start walking around the block? And, giving you that incremental path to becoming increasingly more healthy. Because again, it's this idea of you can't just get it all at once. You have to, what are some things I can do today? And I feel like MSPs feel that the huge stack of stuff you suck at is motivating. And in my experience, I found it's demotivating, right? What the client really wants is what can I do today? And then what can I do tomorrow? So give them that plan that makes sense, that's actionable steps forward, aligned to some kind of standard or something that they can look at and see their progress and see how they're doing. So when not having to talk with your kids, but having to talk with your clients, first thing is that you're going to have to overcome those objections, right? The objections, I'm too small, this sounds expensive, aren't you already doing this for me? So go on and anticipate those objections as an MSP and equip your sales team with what the answers to those things are. Address the expense and the cost of inaction. Again, I think Wes did a good job explaining that, hey, doing nothing is a lot worse answer financially than doing something, and moving that ball, forward. Then we have that idea of convenient and secure, back to the Ferrari analogy of like, have you create an environment for your clients that is more convenient, and the work from home culture we've moved to, and there's been a lot of over rotation towards convenient and a lot of ignoring some of the secure stuff. So now you've kind of got to, how do you bring those back into alignment? It's rarely going to be convenient if it is really secure. So if it's too convenient, you probably need to look at that. Give them that story, man. How do you take the boogeyman from the woods, that's scary out there somewhere and show them this is real, right? The boogeyman is out there. Let's talk about how you might drown in that river right over there. People that drowned in that river before, give them that actual thing that they can see themselves in. And then what is the actionable steps forward? Is how do you give them steps forward so it's not this just heavy lift, too many steps, too expensive? Wes, do you have anything that you'd like to chime in on these points for our MSP friends?
Hey, let's take a page out of Michael Jordan's book, right? Michael Jordan was always into practice, right? If you look at his 20 for 20, he's big on, look, we practice more than anybody else. Nobody is comfortable with doing anything they are not familiar with. And so if these things feel uncomfortable, it's because you're not familiar. You build the familiarity, start with talking about this in front of a mirror, like literally do a cybersecurity conversation in front of the mirror and walk through those objections. Then try it with your wife or your spouse or your husband, whoever it is. Try it then with some friends before you start with the clients. And just understand this takes practice. I didn't walk in, and David, you didn't walk into being comfortable with cybersecurity conversations just naturally. I can't tell you the nerves and the heart pounding that I had going through it. But the more you practice, the more you get comfortable with it, that confidence will exude from you, and you will become more able to share and speak. And you'll notice there's a revenue difference that comes from it. So just get comfortable by practice, practice, practice.
Yeah. And also, guys, internally as an MSP, open up those lines of communication between the guys that your technical team that's in the mix on these security events and your sales team. Because a lot of times the sales team's kind of over here and the technical guys are kind of over here. At some point, buy everybody lunch, pick up some pizzas and say, okay, technical team, tell us how these breaches happen so that you can equip the sales team with the stories they need that are real world to go out and talk. But MSPs, we got to do this, right? We just have to. The small to medium businesses are looking to the MSP community to help us, right? And there is legitimate risk that they're up against. And you guys are on the front lines. You're the ones that can go out there and help them, have those conversations and move the needle along. And you are equal to the task, right? You can do this. You're up for it. Just like as every parent kind of dreads the talk. When you have the talk, it actually goes pretty well and creates some good memories, around that. Similarly, you're equal to the task, you're up for it. So go talk to your clients about it. And don't forget to fill out our session survey. We always like feedback, good, bad, and different. We like to know how we're doing. Hopefully we're hitting the mark from a content standpoint for our MSPs, but feel free to fill out the session survey and let us know how we're doing. Thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to engaging with you after this.